Well, good evening. I am really, really excited about what we're going to be talking about this evening. I remember when I was a little kid, this was a question that I asked my parents, right? This was a question that I asked my Sunday school teacher, and this is a question that I actually remember going up to my pastor after one of his sermons and saying, Pastor Doug, what did Jesus look like? Because see, I had seen all kinds of pictures of Jesus, right? And I had seen there were the pictures of Jesus, like with all the children around him, and he looked really nice, and I thought that would be kind of fun for Jesus to hold me in his lap. And I had seen the pictures of Jesus, in the temple, like, with whips and all of that, kind of angry, and I thought maybe that's not the guy that I'm really interested in hanging out with. And then I had seen the pictures of Jesus on the cross and his incredible sacrifice. And the deal is sometimes Jesus, he had long hair, and sometimes he had blue eyes, and sometimes he had brown hair and black hair, and just all sorts of different features. And I had my Bible that I had received from my church when I was in the third grade, and it had pictures of Jesus in it. But he looked, he didn't look like I thought he would look. And so that's why I asked all of these people. And of course, they all didn't have a really great answer. But it's a difficult thing, mainly because weren't photographs, right? There were not cameras. There was not what was needed. Now, Jesus was God. I'm confident in that. And I'm confident that, if it was a priority for him, that he could have, gathered whatever kind of resources you need to make a photo of himself and leave it in an envelope that, someday some guy named Kodak would find, right? And but it wasn't a priority for him, right? But there are things that we can know. And one of the biggest surprises to me, I've grown up in church my whole life, and so I have a really basic image of what Jesus looks like. And the image of Jesus that I have is, he looks kind of like an American guy, right? But the reality is, Jesus looks more like that than like that, right? And this is the Jesus from the most recent, the Bible series was on, and I don't know, but for a second I thought that he was Brad Pitt, right? And, as much as some of the people I know would love for Jesus to look like Brad Pitt, he probably didn't look like that. He probably looked a whole lot more like this guy over here. Jesus was a Middle Easterner, right? Jesus was from that part of the world. He had skin that looked like the skin of the people in that world. He had hair that looked like the hair of the people in that part of the world. And so that's important. Now, the other thing that is important is to realize there's very little from this time period. In some ways, and a whole lot in other ways. So if you want to find writings that were written in the first century, actual things that were written in that time period, there's very, very little. Very little of things that date to the first century as far as writing is concerned. And it's kind of an anomaly. You can go back a couple of centuries and you can find things, and you can go forward a couple of centuries and you can find things, but during this time there's not a lot of writing. But the thing that we do have, the thing that we have an enormous amount of, are bones. In this part of the world, they were very careful in preserving the bones of the deceased, because they didn't bury people in the ground, right? And you remember the way that Jesus was buried when he died. It was in a tomb, and then they went back into the tomb, like that was a normal thing. Or to me, when I think of they're buried and they're in the tomb, we don't want to go back in there, right? But that was part of their deal. They went back in and they would actually gather the bones later and put them in a box, like a stone box, and they'd write on the box who was in there, right? And they'd put it on the shelf. So all the time, it seems about once a month or every other month, I get, I subscribe to a bunch of archaeology magazines and, websites and stuff. And I get an email saying, new discovery, tomb of, somebody, right? And they're always discovering tombs, and when they find the tombs, there's tons of these bone boxes. As a matter of fact, in Israel, there's a whole kind of government agency that deals with these boxes. There's a little office where they have them all. Well, I'm sure it's more of a warehouse, but whatever. So they've got a bunch of bones, and so you can learn a whole lot about people from their bones. Right, you can figure out obviously how tall they were, how old they were. You can get an idea of how the nutrition was in that period of time. You can look at a set of bones that's just from one person, and you can find out, were they a prize fighter, or were they more of a farmer? You know what I'm saying? And you can sometimes even ascertain how the person died just by looking at their bones. So we've got a lot of bones from this time period, and so one of the things that we know is the kind of average height of people. Now, it is important to look, when you look at the Bible, there's not a whole lot about Jesus' appearance. And I think that part of that tells us that Jesus was kind of an average guy. In the Bible, if there's something kind of peculiar about somebody, they're called like, he was this really tall guy, or he was a really strong guy, or this guy had red hair, or this guy was very attractive looking. But Jesus, we don't get a whole lot. So he was average, probably an average guy as far as height and build and that kind of stuff. And so what that means is we know probably about how tall he was. So the average height of a man in this part of the world in the first century was 5 foot 4 inches tall. Just to give you an idea, Jesus was most likely about as tall as the Queen, right? He was kind of a little guy as far as height is concerned. And so that's what we can really, really clearly tell from the archaeological record. Now here we are. All right. Now, the rest we can look back at the images of Jesus that we have. Now, there is a lot of images that we know of Jesus. And the more recent images, you've got, this is the one that was I've seen in like every church building. There's a certain, if your church building has this picture, I have a very specific smell associated with this picture. You know what I'm talking about? Like an older church building, or like an older Sunday school in the church building that's got that picture of Jesus in it. I know, like there's sometimes that my wife and I, we can be on a walk and we go, I know exactly what that church smells like, right? In the middle, there is Jesus from The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson film, and there is a really famous icon of Jesus that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. That icon is called the Pantocrator icon. So those are kind of the Jesus that we know, but all of those images are not that old. The Pantocrator icon is probably the oldest, and it's from probably around 600 AD, or 600 CE, so it's still not as old as we probably are looking for. So if we want to kind of look at the images of Jesus, in my mind, I thought, okay, so when I'm doing this research, I'm going to try to find some guy's painting of Jesus that was like done in year 50. Like 10, 20 years after Jesus was born. And some guy, one of the disciples or apostles or whatever, paints a picture so people can know what Jesus looked like. There's two problems with that. First off, the people around at that time knew Jesus, and so they didn't need a painting to show what he looked like, right? The second thing, and this is the more important piece, is at that time, there was this worship practice that was common really across the world, and that was ancestor veneration. And the idea that, when your loved ones passed on, if they were really great people, that you could worship them, you could talk to them, and so they would paint the images of these people, especially very holy people, famous priests and that kind of thing, and they would have these images, and they would worship the images, and it was a form of worship that was really common all across the world. But Jewish people and the early Christians did not think that that was a cool thing to do. That was actually really uncool. And so because that was idol worship, right? And so to back up from that and to make sure that there was not temptation to kind of follow this path, they said, let's just not make any images, right? We'll just not do any, we won't paint Jesus at all. And so we don't have to worry about whether or not we're going to worship a painting of Jesus instead of the real person of Jesus, right? However, some people still did it, right? And so you don't find a lot of artwork for Jesus that's kind of on display in very public places, but there is a good bit of old artwork that you can find of Jesus in the catacombs under Rome. And so in these catacombs, there are lots of images that have been really pinpointed as far as their date is concerned. And so we're going to step through a couple of these images. We're going to start with the one that's the youngest and keep getting older and older as we go along. So here's the first one. This one is year 375. And this is great because you see Jesus, he's got his nice halo going on, right? And actually, this is a really cool thing. If you've ever seen the halo, oftentimes it has three little wedges that kind of go behind Jesus' head and meet behind Jesus' head. And that's a symbol of the deity of Christ. It's a symbol of the Trinity, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all met together in the person of Jesus. So, I don't know. I like that kind of stuff. Maybe one day you're going to be on Jeopardy. That's going to be important, right? Here's the next one. This is Jesus with the halo, 375. Next one is the Sol Invictus. And so this is Jesus as the sun, right? Jesus that is the light of the world. So you see that he doesn't just have the halo, but it's kind of radiating out. And so this is a Jesus that is the light of the world. This one was done in about 280 CE. So we're talking about 280, which if he was born in year 28, right, that makes that some amount of years after he died. Right, so the next one is Jesus is called, this is the next two, these are the two oldest, and they're really, really cool. So this one is Jesus healing Lazarus. And so if we had a really awesome, copy of this, you would see that person in the house looks like they're dead, and they've been wrapped up like the dead were in that time. And Jesus is reaching out his hand to heal Lazarus. And then the oldest one is in year 235. This is the earliest known image of Jesus. And it's Jesus healing the paralytic. And so you've got the guy kind of on the mat, and Jesus reaching out his hand to him and healing him. Now, they're a little blurry, but I don't know about you, but when I see this, when I think of this just being separated by a couple hundred years from Jesus, that's pretty cool. This is the oldest image of Jesus that is on the earth that we know about right now. Now, what can we discern about his appearance? One of the things that's interesting that you can discern, so this right here, the robes that he's wearing are specific robes. It's robes of a scholar, and it really has way more to do with the culture into which it was first depicted, to show Jesus as a scholar, Jesus as one of these that he would be on par with the scholars of the time. The other thing that you see is actually the older you get, the less likely it is for Jesus to have facial hair. As a matter of fact, facial hair on Jesus is not common in artwork until around the year 500. So somewhere in the 6th century, right there, Jesus, you're going to see from then on, Jesus has the beard, the Jesus that we are familiar with. But earlier, this one and then the one prior to it, it's clean-shaven Jesus. So that's what we can see from art. And then there's this other thing that you've probably heard of called the Shroud of Turin. And as luck would have it, there was a huge amount of new research released on Holy Saturday. That's the Saturday before Easter Sunday. And they released a lot of detailed photographs, and they also released a great iPad app. So that's it. You can't really tell it very well here, but let's zoom it out so we can see. That right there is the face of Jesus in the Shroud of Turin. Now, the dating for the shroud is an interesting thing. So, if you remember, we talked a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, about the dating for Jericho and how it's gone back and forth between lots of different dates. The same things happened with the Shroud of Turin. Initially it claims to be Jesus, and so the initial dating of it is right there at year 28 CE. And then from then on, there's been lots of people who did things like they cut off a piece and they put it in a machine, and the machine spit out certain dates. Like one of them said it was a medieval thing, and then another one said no, it was actually way before Jesus, and another one said it was way after Jesus. Well, so the most recent dating for the shroud gives it a very large range from 300 BCE, so 330 years or so before the death of Christ, all the way through to year 400 CE. So that's, 370 years after the death of Christ. What that means, though, is that the most recent scholarship tells us that it's possible. It's possible that this is Jesus. Now, I think that it's easier to see it in the negative. So this is what it actually looks like, and I want you to grab that. But in just a second, we're going to kind of leave it on this image because it's a lot easier to see, right? But before we do, the really interesting thing to me about this whole deal is the blood stains. So if you look right here, right at his side, is a huge blood stain. And it's all the places that you kind of expect, right? Right here on the crown of thorns, that's where another stain is. And then this is it was folded over, so this is now we're getting into his back, and you see all the places here where it shows kind of where he was whipped, and then a huge stain down here at his feet. Now, they've taken these blood stains and they've scraped off some of the blood, and there it is. That's a picture of one of the blood cells on one of the pieces of the Shroud of Turin. And so when they've run the analysis on this, the blood on there is type AB, which I think is probably in Luke chapter 5, where it says that Jesus had type AB blood. It's type AB. The other thing that they found about the blood is that it's very consistent with the biblical record, and that they can tell whether or not blood, what happened, was released from the body after the body was dead or before the body was dead. And so this blood is the blood from the wound from the side, and all of that happens after the body is dead, and that blood is consistent. As a matter of fact, it's also consistent with the fact that this person is the color of the blood, the way it's stained, and the vibrance of the color is because of he was beaten, and he went through a lot of trauma, and so when that happens, the bilirubin in the blood is released, and I don't understand all the science behind it, but it makes a really red stain. And so all of this points to, if not Jesus, somebody who is very similar to him, right? And so we learned that from the blood. Another piece of this is all over the shroud. There's pollen, and as a matter of fact, there's several places where the pollen is really clear, And so what they've done, of course, is they'll scrape some of the pollen off of the shroud. And when they did that, here we go. When they did that, they could find out where this pollen comes from, what kind of plants it is. So this right here, these are the pieces of pollen that came from the shroud. And so when they did that, they found the plants, the pollen. There's actually about 50 different types of plants, and all of those plants come from 3 regions of the world. And so there's several plants that are found exclusively in Israel, which is, you would expect that. There's several plants that are found exclusively in France and in that region of the world, and several plants that are found exclusively in Italy. And that's kind of the known progression that we have for the shroud, right? As far as where it went, and when you trace back what we actually know about its origins, that all kind of matches up with that. But I think the most interesting piece of the whole deal is the image itself. So the image itself, when they take it and put it under a microscope, it's very unique. Right? If you were to come in with this fabric and paint it, right, the paint would just soak in and stain the fabric all the way through, just kind of soak through. But when you look at this under a microscope, the image of the shroud is actually only on one side of the threads. It's not soaked through. It's not some sort of chemical agent that's changed the colors of the thread altogether. It's only on one side. And so they've, over the years, people have tried to kind of recreate the shroud and recreate all of the kind of pieces of it and make it look the same and all of that. And they haven't been able to. It's only been recently that one guy has come close. Because every other time when they do that, it's not on one side of the threads, right? It soaks through. It goes all the way through the material. But recently, a guy was able to get a one-sided kind of burn on it using a very, very highly tuned laser. Now, I think of all of that, it can tell us a couple of things. The first thing about the Shroud of Turin is it tells us that it's definitely old. Just to even fake the blood, the parts of the blood, like we didn't understand blood well enough to understand what had to happen for it to make sense and agree until about the year 1500. So until that point, we don't have what it takes to fake it. And then, we don't even have now. Like even with our nice, really highly calibrated laser, we can't fake the image. So it is very old. And the other thing that is really crazy about this is there, around 600, in the region of Edessa, there was a shroud that was brought that was said to be the image of Jesus. And when that shroud was brought to this region, it was kind of hung in a frame to show the face. And from that point forward, it really influenced the art of the region. And it influenced all the art from that point forward. And the art began to look like the shroud of Edessa. And so artists would go and look at it and kind of discern its features and paint their pictures of Jesus to match this supposed artifact. So we're going to go back. There you go. There we go. Oh, almost. So remember I told you that we were going to look at that icon. This is one of the icons from that time period. And it matches. It matches. You see the kind of right eye is different from the left eye. That's the same with the shroud. The right eye is very different. The hair on the right side is longer than on the left side. There's a lot of details that you see. Actually, at this moment in time, a change in the artwork to reflect this kind of common language of what the features of Jesus look like. And those features match the shroud. There's some debate as to whether or not the Shroud of Edessa is the Shroud of Turin, but when you look at the art side by side with the shroud, it's difficult to not see how it matches. So why should we even talk about it? Well, why do we spend time on this? Well, it really points to something that is absolutely profound. Other world religions, you have really great people. You have deities that do incredible things and some not so incredible things. You have people who can, do things like part the waters and cause rain to fall and all of that kind of stuff. But Christianity is unique in that God himself came down, lived life as a human, and then died to sacrifice himself for us. And the curiosity of what Jesus looks like is part of this kind of curiosity that I have. The question that is it real? Did he really come down? Was God really human? It's a question that is at the core of our faith, at the core of what we believe. And the historical proof for who Jesus was, that he was here and that he died, is pretty well founded. And then when you look at the proofs that the disciples gave, right, when they were asked about Jesus' death and resurrection, it's great. It's kind of the best proof you could hope for as a believer. They said, look, just don't take my word for it. He was here for many days. There are tons of people. Just go and talk to somebody who saw him. That was their proof. They didn't have a picture. They said, look, everybody saw him. We all know that part of the story is true. And so at the very beginning of time, the very beginning of this story that God has been telling, Adam and Eve break the law, right? They violate the one rule and they sin. And so when they sin, God creates clothes for them. He creates clothes for them out of the skin of animals. There's only one way you're going to part an animal with its skin, right? God makes the very first sacrifice in the Garden of Eden. And from that point forward, it is very clear, right, that because of the sin that is in the world, sin causes death. And that the only way to deal with sin is to cover that sin with blood. So there's a sacrificial system set up, and it goes on and on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But the problem is, all of those animals, even as perfect as they are, they don't have free will. They can't choose to offer themselves up as sacrifice. They can't live a perfect life. So the offering has to be repeated over and over and over until Jesus comes in the flesh with a real face, right? Jesus comes, he suffers all of the humiliation of what it means to be human, right? Who knows if he had a beard when he was older, but at some point he was, going through adolescence and he had the one really long hair, right? He came and suffered through being a baby and being a teenager, through this incredible death for one reason. So that what was broken in the Garden of Eden, our relationship with God, can be mended. It's because Jesus was human and died for us that we can commune with God, that we can pray to God. And so really the quest for what Jesus' face looks like is really a quest to understand salvation. Salvation comes through this human and divine person who died for us. And all he asks in return is that we follow him. And so this evening, I'm just going to spend some time in prayer, and Landon and Allie are going to sing a song. But if you have really kind of not, been skeptical about everything, and you've been on the outside, and you think maybe you're willing to follow Jesus, he wants you to follow him. He came and he died for you. And tonight can be that moment where you turn right where you are. You don't have to be perfect, but you can make that first step towards Jesus. Or maybe it's been a while, and maybe for you, the idea of Jesus being perfect and the sacrifice, you remember, and you think, maybe it's time for me to get serious again. And so if that's you, I want you to have whatever time you need. If you want to come forward, or if you want to pray right there in your seat, we want to give you time to respond to the mystery of God coming down in human form, suffering, dying, and raising from the dead so that we can once again have a relationship. So right now, we're going to take advantage of that sacrifice, and we're going to pray. We're going to talk to God himself. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thanks for coming down, for having skin. Thanks for coming down and having a body and dealing with all of what it means to be human. Thanks for dying a very difficult, horrible death. And we confess that we have not, we often will forget. Right? We'll let that go, and we'll go through our life not thinking of you as this human person who came and died, but as this kind of detached God in the sky. Forgive us for that. Help us this week, and even tonight, to keep the fact that you came as a human to live and to die in the center of our vision. Help us to use that to motivate us to be people that you have asked us to be. So right now, God, we're going to spend some time confessing, praying to you. Would you speak to us?